In 1850, 2 years after Sir John Franklin and his entire crew vanished, a rescue team finally arrived on Beechey Island to search for the lost expedition. What they discovered was far more disturbing than they could have ever imagined. The bodies they found were not just dead. They were twisted and broken, frozen in positions that suggested a horrifying struggle. But it wasn't the contorted bodies that haunted the rescuers the most. It was their eyes. Hollow, vacant, still locked on the vast, endless void, as if they were still staring into eternity. Their lifeless eyes, frozen by the Arctic cold, seemed to pierce the soul of anyone who dared to look into them. The sailors didn't just find dead men, they found evidence of something far darker. The remains had been hastily buried, suggesting a rushed and desperate attempt to cover up the grisly scene. But upon closer inspection, they uncovered disturbing clues that hinted at something beyond the realm of nature. The marks on the graves, the unexplained positioning of the bodies, it was as if the men had faced a fate that went beyond simple death. The evidence pointed to something supernatural, something that pushed these explorers beyond their breaking point. For decades, the world had wondered what happened to Sir John Franklin and his men. They had set sail from England in 1845 with the goal of finding the legendary Northwest Passage, a fabled route that would link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, equipped with the latest technology and supplies, were intended to be the vessels that would conquer the icy wilderness of the Arctic. Yet, shortly after entering Baffin Bay, both ships disappeared without a trace. No one ever heard from them again. But what if the reason behind their disappearance wasn't just the merciless Arctic environment? What if something else was at play? A force that went beyond the physical. Something that drove the men into madness, pushing them into a nightmarish descent, leaving their bodies frozen in the ice. When the bodies were finally uncovered, they didn't tell a story of simple tragedy. They whispered of something far darker, a mystery that would remain unsolved for over a century. The grave on Beechey Island stands as a chilling reminder of the expedition's tragic end. But it's not the end of the story. The discovery of these bodies was just the beginning. What if Franklin's crew had encountered something more terrifying than the Arctic's cold grip? What if something from beyond the physical realm had taken control? What if they had crossed paths with something far worse than mere starvation and freezing temperatures? For more than a century, the world struggled to understand the mystery surrounding the disappearance of Sir John Franklin and his crew. What could explain the vanishing of two highly equipped ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, along with their crew of 129 men? At first, many believed the answer lay in the unforgiving Arctic environment, a harsh, relentless landscape that had claimed so many lives before. The ice, the cold, and the brutal conditions of the frozen north seemed like the most logical explanation. But the mystery didn't stop there. Too many questions remained unanswered, and the clues that were left behind hinted at something far darker. By the late 1840s, after hearing nothing from the ships for 2 years, the Royal Navy finally launched an official search. Multiple expeditions were dispatched to find Franklin and his men, and over time, a few theories began to surface. According to many, the ships had been trapped in the ice, unable to break free. The pack ice of the Arctic, notorious for its unpredictability, could easily have turned into a deadly prison, preventing any movement. With no way out, the crew would have been forced to face starvation, exposed to the bitter cold and the vast, isolated wilderness of the Arctic. However, it wasn't just starvation that tormented the men. A deadly disease, scurvy, quickly took hold. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a silent killer that plagued explorers in the 19th century, and Franklin's crew was no exception. The disease weakened the men, causing them to suffer from bleeding gums, fatigue, and excruciating pain. Their bodies were literally breaking down while the ice held them captive. At first, it seemed like just another tragic tale of exploration gone wrong, but as more research emerged, it became clear that something even more sinister was involved. In the years that followed, scientists uncovered a chilling discovery: lead poisoning. It turned out that the preserved food the men had relied on for survival was sealed in cans with lead solder. The lead, which had leached into the food, was slowly poisoning the crew. The toxic effects of lead, compounded by scurvy, drained the men's strength and caused mental confusion. Their physical health deteriorated, but their minds, too, became unrecognizable, consumed by the effects of the poison. The scientific community now faced a much more complex explanation than simple starvation. Lead poisoning, scurvy, and the brutal environment had combined to create the perfect storm of disease, despair, and madness. Yet, even with these findings, many were left wondering, was this enough to explain the terrifying events the sailors experienced? Could the tragedy really have been caused by physical illness, or was there something darker, something unseen, playing a role in their ultimate fate? As the search for the lost Franklin expedition continued, one crucial piece of the puzzle had long been overlooked: the oral traditions of the Inuit. For decades, their accounts were dismissed as mere folklore, their voices drowned out by the relentless pursuit of Western exploration and scientific reasoning. However, as more pieces of the mystery fell into place, it became clear that these stories were not only credible, but essential to understanding what truly happened to Franklin and his men. The Inuit, who had lived alongside the harsh Arctic environment for centuries, held their own version of events. They spoke of strange white men wandering the icy wilderness near Back River, looking lost, weak, and starved. These men, already ravaged by scurvy and lead poisoning, weren't merely battling the extreme conditions of nature. They were being controlled by something more sinister, something invisible, something far beyond the cold or hunger. It was as if the land itself was claiming them, drawing them into an unknowable, terrifying fate. The Inuit described these sailors as walking ghosts, their eyes hollow and vacant, their bodies frail and skeletal, but somehow still animated, not fully dead, yet not fully alive either. It was as though they were still clinging to something, perhaps their humanity, but that grip was slipping away piece by piece. The men wandered the ice, faces blank, consumed by a dark presence that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Even the Inuit, with their deep understanding of the land, could feel it too, a strange, unsettling heaviness in the air, an invisible force that they could not explain. But it was the most chilling part of the Inuits' accounts that would leave anyone who heard them deeply unsettled: their description of cannibalism. The Inuit spoke of how some of the sailors, driven to desperation and overwhelmed by madness, turned on one another. Having already witnessed death, starvation, and disease, the crew's humanity was stripped away completely. Now, these men, already broken, began to eat their fellow sailors, driven by hunger, despair, and the unnatural forces that controlled them. Some Inuit elders spoke of finding the remains of dismembered bodies torn apart in a way that no human being could have possibly survived. But the hunger alone did not explain the horrors. The Inuit believed that a supernatural force had been haunting the men. They believed that the spirits of the dead had taken hold of the sailors, forcing them to commit acts beyond human comprehension. According to some Inuit, the spirits of those who had died on the expedition had become trapped in the land, unable to pass on. They had been claimed by the Arctic, and now the land itself had become their grave, a desolate, frozen resting place where vengeful spirits roamed, waiting to drag others into the same fate. The Inuit did not just witness the sailors' physical decline, they sensed a malevolent presence in the air, as if the Arctic itself had a life of its own. It was a life that had reached out and consumed the men, body and soul. To the Inuit, the Arctic was not just a desolate, freezing wasteland. It was a place where the boundary between life and death was thin, where the dead could return, where spirits roamed freely, and where fate was not merely controlled by the elements. As searchers from Europe began to piece together the details of Franklin's fate, the Inuit grew more insistent. Their stories were no longer dismissed but became a crucial part of solving the mystery. These accounts were no longer seen as superstitions. They were integral to understanding what had really happened in the frozen expanse of the Arctic. The Inuit spoke of ghostly figures and sailors being controlled by forces beyond their comprehension. They described a darkness that had settled over Franklin's men, a darkness not just of the night, but a presence that had overtaken them. With every expedition that returned with more details, the Inuit stories grew more credible. They were not just seeing the slow deterioration of the crew, they were witnessing the supernatural force at work, one that lured the men into madness and death, and which still lingered in the cold winds and shifting ice of the Arctic. These stories, passed down through generations, would finally be recognized for what they truly were, an indispensable part of the tragic tale of Franklin's doomed expedition. The Inuits' words had helped to illuminate the parts of the story that science and reason alone could never explain. The supernatural had indeed played a crucial role in the expedition's horrific demise. As the expedition ventured deeper into the Arctic, the situation became increasingly dire. The ice, which had initially been just another obstacle to overcome, had now transformed into a prison, its grip tightening with every passing day. With no way to free the ships and no hope of escape, the men were forced to face the crushing realization that they might never leave the ice alive. By the winter of 1846, the pack ice had trapped the ships so thoroughly that the crew had no choice but to settle in for a long, grueling winter. At first, the men held on to the hope that the ice would eventually break, that the ships would be freed when the weather changed. But spring came and went, and still they were stuck, immobilized by the thick, unyielding ice, with no sign of the relief they so desperately sought. As the months dragged on, the extreme Arctic conditions began to take a toll on both the bodies and minds of the men. Weakened by scurvy and lead poisoning, they began to show signs of extreme fatigue and mental deterioration. Some could barely stand or walk, their movements slow and unsteady as the atmosphere on board the ships grew increasingly grim. The days seemed endless, with the cold seeping into their bones and the never-ending darkness of the Arctic night casting an oppressive shadow over their spirits. But it wasn't just the cold that started to wear them down. Something else was happening. Strange occurrences began to unfold. Eerie noises would echo across the deck in the dead of night, screams, whispers, and groans that seemed to come from the very ice itself. Sailors began to report seeing shadows in the fog, flickering lights in the distance, and glimpses of figures that would vanish whenever they tried to approach. At first, these sightings were dismissed as the result of exhaustion, hunger, and the harsh conditions. But as they grew more frequent, the men began to wonder if there was something far more sinister at play. One night, a sailor named William Fitzjames, exhausted and delirious from the cold, claimed to have seen a figure standing in the mist, staring at him from a distance. He described the figure as tall, gaunt, with no face, its body barely visible through the thick fog. Fitzjames was not the only one to see it. Several other men reported the same eerie sight, but when they approached, the figure would vanish into the mist, leaving only the echo of haunting whispers behind. Was it a ghost? A figment of their imagination? Or something else entirely, Wiki, something that couldn't be explained? As the men of the Erebus and Terror struggled through the endless winter, the supernatural presence that had been hinted at in the Inuit stories began to feel all too real. The wind howled through the masts, but it didn't sound like the wind anymore. It sounded like voices, whispers of the dead, or perhaps something even darker, urging the men to give up, to surrender to the ice. The ghostly figures continued to appear and disappear, and the men began to believe they were being stalked by something beyond human understanding. With Franklin's health deteriorating rapidly and the pressure mounting, the crew's mental state began to unravel. It wasn't just the freezing temperatures or the constant threat of starvation. The men were beginning to lose their grip on reality. Some started to wonder if they had been cursed, if they had crossed an invisible line into a place where the living and the dead coexisted, where the rules of nature no longer applied. Had they crossed into a realm of the supernatural? By the time Franklin died in June of 1847, the remaining officers were on the verge of despair. The spiritual presence in the ice, the shadowy figures, and the voices from nowhere. It seemed as if the men had been claimed by something unseen that neither science nor reason could explain. They had ventured into the wild, unforgiving Arctic, but what they encountered there was far worse than they could have imagined. As the men faced the final descent into madness, Captain Crozier made the fateful decision to abandon the ships and head south toward the mainland, toward Back River, hoping to find rescue. But even then, the ghosts and shadows didn't leave them. No matter where they went, no matter how far they traveled, the ice seemed to have a hold on them, and the dark presence continued to follow, feeding off their fear and despair. More than a century passed before the truth behind the disappearance of Franklin's expedition began to emerge. In the 2010s, modern technology and the rediscovery of Inuit oral histories finally unlocked the remaining pieces of the puzzle. In 2014, after more than 170 years of mystery, the wreck of HMS Erebus was found in Queen Maud Gulf. 2 years later, HMS Terror was located in Terror Bay, just off King William Island. However, these discoveries only deepened the mystery. The wrecks, astonishingly well preserved by the Arctic ice, contained critical artifacts, maps, journals, and personal belongings of the men. Yet, the question remained, why had these ships ended up so far from where they had been trapped in the ice? Was there new evidence that could reveal the crew's final movements? Brandy Lockhart, an underwater archaeologist with Parks Canada, suggested that the ships might have been carried south by shifting ice. Inuit accounts also indicated the possibility that some crew members had tried to return to the ships in their final moments, only to succumb to the ice and madness. The mystery, chilling as it was, remains unresolved. But the wrecks, the Inuit stories, and the evidence uncovered over the years tell a tale of a crew that faced much more than the harsh Arctic. They encountered something far darker.